so it's like, you know about drugs and breast milk? Yep. And I did breastfeed. I was very successful. I breastfed my son for 27 months. I only started off to do it for a year, but after that, I'll tell you why. I mean, I certainly got all those kinds of looks from people.
You're still breastfeeding?
Yes, because it gets easy. My son had, some babies just kind of give it up, but he didn't seem to have any inclination to give it up, and I found it's easy. It's just easy, especially after you get several months down the road. So how was I successful? One is that I was doggedly determined to be a successful breastfeeder. And I was very, I embrace all the good things that breastfeeding can do. And I'll share those with you as we go through. So I was very committed, but I had a very supportive spouse. And I had... So that's important. They have to kind of go along with it. See, with the first baby, and they don't know anything about, so I'm not talking to you guys. So when they don't know it, and you're like, they'll say, what's wrong with the baby? Well, this. And they just think you're a genius. But honestly, there's only three things. They're hungry, they're wet, or they are tired. So it gets easy, right? So they just think, man, you understand. It's like, yes, I do, I think. So my mom breastfed, so that's important to have a community. Also, I had two good friends, very good friends, who had been very successful, and they were supportive. And the last, which goes to you all, is that I had the most wonderful pediatrician in the world, Colleen Dooley. She retired a couple of years ago. And she was Cameron's pediatrician for 20 years. She was phenomenal. So when I would come in and go, okay, I'm 18 months in and I'm still breastfeeding, she was like, women all over the world outside the United States breastfeed. And if you are comfortable, she goes, I have no problem. She was so supportive. Even in the beginning, when it's the hardest, she was very supportive. I had friends who, as soon as they wanted to give up, their pediatricians were good, go to formula. So not all pediatricians are the same. And I didn't deal with anybody outside of a pediatrician. I also interviewed my pediatrician. I wanted, because I knew from other friends that some pediatricians were not very supportive. So I interviewed, and I selected her because of her reputation and what she said. So that was another plus. I also got educated, so I went to classes there. So I went through Baptist Integris, and they had wonderful prenatal classes. But I signed up for 2 breastfeeding classes, and I did exactly what they told me. It was not easy, but it worked. And I availed myself of lactation specialists when I needed it. But usually once you get about past the first month, it's fairly easy. At least it was for me. And I think it's if you do the things that people tell you to do. So that's kind of my background. And we're going to go through today all the benefits of breastfeeding. Mostly I want you to know them because these are the things you need to explain to or to tell or teach or educate or help support the women that you see that may want to breastfeed. So in your moms, do you know if they breastfed? Okay, so your moms are probably in that group where the uptick, because in the 1970s, 50s through 70s, we hit the lowest part or point in the United States in terms of breastfeeding women. So your moms are a little bit past that. So that's important if you've got family that did it and were supportive. Yes? Yeah.
Did you feel like you saw the benefits of breastfeeding with your son?
Yes, he is extremely healthy. Now, he would have been a healthy kid. I mean, he could have been healthy without, I don't know, but very healthy. He was in daycare, so his immune system, I think, is extremely good and was very challenged. But by the time he got to first grade, he just never missed unless he was malingering. You know. But he just wasn't sick. Really wasn't sick. Yes,
Did
Jim?
he stop on his own, or did you have to like leave him?
I had really was trying to plan another pregnancy, and he was losing interest. Yeah, I was down to maybe twice a day at that point, so it was that was easy. And it didn't cause me any distress at all. I mean, in terms of liking breast. At that point, you're not nursing that often, so you're not producing that much milk, and so it's pretty easy. It was not hard for me, but now I'm an N of 1. So others of you that have breastfed, I certainly welcome your experience as well. Any other questions or comments? Okay. All right. Let's look at a little history. No body fluid is as provocative as breast milk. We are more passionate about breast milk than we are, do we give a rip about, I mean, are we as passionate about urine, sweat, tears, snot, poop, maybe, in older patients, maybe. But it's probably one of the most provocative of the body fluids. You see in even data, or things that go back 2,000–3,000 years, you will see things alluded to in terms of breastfeeding. In Egyptian, not literature, but in the material that's left from them, you see references to it. So in Greek mythology, Hera, who was she?
Zeus's wife.
Yeah, Zeus's wife, queen of the gods. Her breast milk was said to give Hercules his strength. He was an illegitimate child of Zeus, and so one of the other, Athena, snuck him in and put him on her breast, and supposedly that's where he got his strength. Also, the myth is that she also gave birth to the Milky Way. So this is Rubens' picture of Hera and Hercules, and the story goes is that Hercules bit her, she pulled him off the breast, her milk sprayed out, and gave birth to the Milky Way. The person I love the most is Zeus. Do you see him sitting off there to the side? What are you doing? It's a lot of it. You could interpret his expression a lot of different ways. So, the ability to feed an infant is vital to a civilization. Okay? If you cannot get a lot of your children to grow up, then you depopulate, right? So survival is really important. So breastfeeding, or the ability to feed an infant, goes back with bottles. We think that our nursing bottles are new, but these things are back to 2,000 and 3,000 years old. So there were vessels that were made, terracotta mostly, that were used to feed infants. So if the mom died, something happened, then these were used. And these were used for quite a length of time. The problem came is that they weren't easy to clean. So infections tended to be a big problem, and children not able to survive that. The other is as old as it is, or formulas are new to us, substituting other milks for mother's milk has gone back 2,000 and 3,000 years as well. So donkey, goat, probably one of the more common, sheep, mixing it with breads and feeding it to children. The problem is that it's not totally designed for a child, and so that led to a lot of problems in children, their survival, and their nutrition. Wet nurses, substituting one woman for another. For a lot of reasons. The mom dies, and you've got an infant to feed. This is a contract that I found that goes back to 232 BC between a man and a wet nurse, a contract. That statue was found in King Tut's tomb. It's thought to be his wet nurse, and a picture of him, or a statue of him when he was a baby. So wet nurses have been used for eons to feed infants. They became very popular in the Middle Ages coming forward. Women, elite women who were of high status didn't breastfeed. They hired wet nurses. It even became quite an industry in England and in Europe in the 17, 18, and 1900s. Women would set up these businesses and they would serve as wet nurses. Even really good wet nurses would then employ other wet nurses to take kids, and so it was quite a business. I read that at one point in the 1800s, only about 10% of children in Paris were actually nursed by their own mother. So there's always been a move towards how do you substitute this, how do I get out from under this. Maybe women didn't want to breastfeed, or they couldn't breastfeed, or they were having multiple children and they couldn't keep up, or women died. So one of the advancements came is when they started figuring out that the vessel you put it in, and we understood where germs came from, that what we were using to feed was a problem. The other thing that helped was when rubber. So rubber came around in the 1880s, so you could develop a nipple. So these are bottles that are about 100 years old going back. So glass was a huge improvement when we found glass and rubber, put it together. This was a big step in terms of keeping the infant mortality rate down from infections. The ones at the bottom are, I think, unusual, but you can see where even some of them nowadays are shaped more like that. So they have that same idea. They had glass stoppers in them. The little thing on the top of this bottom one is how they filled it with milk. Down here. This one. Okay. So the first formula came about in 1867, and it was made from cow's milk. Nestle was a huge one in Switzerland that started producing formulas as well. The problem is that they based them more off cow's milk. They didn't put any vitamins or supplements in them, so they were very substandard. As they moved along, they figured out more and more what it needed to be. So you see, even in 1911, formulas came on that were more similar to breast milk. Then they started developing ones that were more specialty-based, like soy-based. Child had a reaction to the cow's milk, pretty common. They moved them on to a different one. Well, once they figured out women would go for this, then the marketing became extremely strong. And so by 1950 through 1970, we hit real lows in this country in terms of the number of women who breastfed. There weren't any standards for it. Nobody was really overseeing that. You didn't really have government agencies, and this was a worldwide problem. So in 1980, so not that long ago, there was an international adoption of a standard for formulas. Now there are 400 formula products on the market. It's incredible. So, but we have a lot of women who start breastfeeding. It's the continuation that continues to be more of the struggle. And I'll come back to some of that in a little bit. Any comments on that or questions? Okay. Okay, so let's talk about lactogenesis. So this is the ability to produce milk. It's a fairly complicated process. It starts in pregnancy. About halfway through, estrogen and progesterone have a lot of influence on the breast in terms of developing those ducts and globules. where the milk is going to be produced. And some milk is produced during the very latter part of pregnancy. And women may even be able to express a little bit of milk. It's not considered abnormal, it's considered normal. Some women won't produce any, but a little bit is not unusual. It's a complex in that it involves lots of organs. So the pituitary, hypothalamus play a big role. A lot of hormones play a role. So you've got prolactin, you've got dopamine, you have oxytocin, you have estrogen and progesterone, insulin, cortisol also play a role. So it's very complex. It's amazing. It usually works in most women. So if you work down through there, once women deliver, then that dopamine inhibitory effect goes down and prolactin levels start going up. The initial milk that's produced is called what? Colostrum. Okay. And then within a few days, within that first week, then women's milk, there's a let-down reflex, and they'll start producing lots of milk, or quite a bit more in there, and so the woman will become very aware of that. The last part of lactogenesis and lactation is mechanical stimulation. The most effective way to produce milk is you have to keep emptying the breasts. If you don't continue that emptying, the brain will just stop producing prolactin and the milk production will go down. So that's one of the big encouragements early on, and I think also the education is what it will take, what it expects. Babies can nurse every 2 or 3 hours, so that's quite a demand on women, and that's all around the clock. Okay, so why is oxytocin in there? What's its role? What else? Milk let down, what else does it do? Why do we give it to a woman in labor? Contraction. So it's also going to help there with muscle contraction. And then the prolactin is there for the production of milk itself. Okay. So milk composition, made for a human. Cow's milk is not. It's similar, but it's made for a baby cow. It's not made for a baby human. So look at what's in there. There's sugars and carbohydrates for energy. There's all kinds of fats. There's all kinds of proteins. So in terms of meeting nutrition, it is complete. And it's exactly what a baby needs. And it will change. That composition will change from day 1 to when they're 6 months. So it adapts over time to what the child will need. Let's look at functions. These are really important. These are the things you will want to educate women about. Nutritional support, okay, that's a given. But it's the immune. And you're going to see as we go through the benefits of breastfeeding how that plays out. The immune role is huge. The anti-inflammatory, in terms of its effect on the gut, is major. So the #1 cause of infant death around the world are more GI diseases, necrotizing enterocolitis. Breastfeeding reduces that. The gut when you are born is not developed. It takes about 1 year. Breastfeeding does a lot in helping the increase or the development or promote the development of the GI tract. So the GI tract is a big defense for us. It can keep things out of our body that don't belong there. So it's thought that the increase in allergies, type 1 diabetes has been attributed to the early intake of cow's milk before the age of 1. Because it's a foreign protein. It sets up the immune system to recognize foreign. So yes. Go ahead.
Oh, I know there's like conflicting data between if you're supposed to give a baby water before a certain age, because breast milk is already composed with so much water.
Yeah, you don't need to give water.
Water yet.
Don't need to give water to a breastfed infant. If they're fully breastfed, they don't need water.
Is it bad to give them water? Like, is there a GI tract made for it?
I was told it is because it fills them up so they don't get the nutrients.
Yeah, the only thing is I've had it, like when Cameron was in daycare, they would call me if he was ready and I could go over there and feed him at lunch. But one of the things they would do is they just give him a couple of ounces of water to stave him off. So that's the only thing, is their little stomachs are very tiny. I'll show you some pictures of them. So that would be probably the downside. They just don't need it. And what they get from the mother is going to be free of bacteria, any contaminants, anything in your water that is put there, chemicals, they'll get. But if you get it from the mom, those won't be in there. Aid in digestion, cellular components. Look at these, so that you get macrophages, lymphocytes, neutrophils, epithelial cells. Why are macrophages important? Out of all of those, why are those the ones that we would be the most interested in? Okay, they are antigen-presenting cells, right? Look, do neutrophils do that? No, they're phagocytized, will phagocytize foreign stuff, but they won't present it to the immune system. So those macrophages are really good. This lasts for about 6 months, up to 6 months. The passive transfer of maternal immunity and those other cells of the immune system are there for about 6 months. So these are huge in protecting that gut. That is probably the one thing to remember the most, is that the gut isn't developed. The gut develops best in the presence of breast milk, and the other problems that we're going to go through are also reduced because of that. Regulation of milk production, frequent feeding, frequent pumping is the #1 way to keep your milk supply up. If you are very intent on totally supplying all milk through breast milk, then that is, you get very, you can't really see what they're doing, how much you're producing. So sometimes that's for women not knowing if there's enough milk. It's not like giving them a bottle and you see how much they take down. So that milk production is really anxiety producing in the beginning. Once you get milk established, and the other thing is that it takes about a month for the babies to get to full demand feeding. So once you get out a month, then the infant, when they're hungry, they'll demand a feeding. Up until that time, and progressively they move towards that. But in the first few days, you have to put them on a schedule of feeding. And so one of the things they taught me in the classes is that you wake them up. You wake them up to feed. I cannot tell you, my mother and I are like, don't wake up that sleeping baby. I'm like, I'm waking him up. So I did, but it's good in establishing. If you let them sleep too long, then your breast will start to adapt to that. So the breast adapt to whatever feeding schedule you put them on. When they get ready to grow, so you get different growth spurts in infants, 2 and 6 weeks, they'll start nursing more often. They will get ready for that growth spurt by forcing you to increase your milk supply. So that is extremely important. Okay, questions about that? Comments from anybody? Oh, okay.
Sorry, I don't plan on breastfeeding. Was it proven that allergies and type 1 diabetes have been increased?
It is, yes. It is a high suspicion as a factor. Now, not everybody,
yeah,
but it is counted.
Okay. I was wondering if that was like...
As a factor, yes.
Sure.
Okay. Under A, breastfeeding A, you'll see that about 75% of women initiate breastfeeding. So that's good. That is really good. But it really differs by the age, by the ethnicity, Probably goes to community and how they look at that. Support is huge, and so socioeconomic. So if you look, 81% of Hispanic moms start breastfeeding. You see it the lowest in African Americans and in young African Americans under 20. You see it higher with women of higher income. Let's see what else is there. It can also be a regional thing. If this is this shows the number of women who ever initiated breastfeeding. So you'll see it's kind of regional. South kind of has its own regional. The West is probably the highest. We're pretty good in Oklahoma. We are in about the 65% range, so that's pretty good. You see Mississippi and West Virginia are the lowest. Comments about that? Okay. All right, so I'm going to show you this graph, then we'll look at the table that's in your handout. So every year, we've talked about this before, every decade the government sets goals for the health of the population, the health of the country. They call it Healthy People 2010, now we're in the 2020, and they'll take a goal, and it's a tone. I mean, there's beyond this. And they'll set a standard that they want to meet, and then they'll set what percent they want to hit, the target they want to hit. And then every year or two, they will look at how are they hitting those targets. And then they will publish them so that people can see them. So this was the Healthy People 2010. So if you look at, from 1970, that was one of our lowest, the low of the low. This top line is ever started. Here you're near only 20% of women ever even started. Because the nutrition companies, they get those formulas into the hospitals very early, and they will start them if the mom isn't started feeding right away.
Dr. LaCassie, they even send it when I was
pregnant. Yes, they do.
I get stuff in the mail. I don't even know how they knew I was pregnant, but I got lots of formula in the mail.
Yeah, they give you a basket when you leave that's got formula.
But my mom also got formula in the mail, and I was like 20. So, yeah.
So you'll see that the number of women who are still breastfeeding at 6 months. Okay. So why would 6 months be an important marker?
That's when I started.
The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that that's when you start introducing foods. Okay, now people do that before. But at 6 months is usually when you start introducing like cereals, or that was what they did when I was at that point. You'll see the gray line, exclusive. So we would really like women to be exclusively breastfeeding. Not everybody can do that in their circumstance, but you'll see that we don't even have data before, because these are two different data sets, and that's why you have that break. So exclusive at 3 months, about a decade ago, we were at about 20%. And at 1 year, you see we're about 10 or 15%. Okay. Exclusive at 6 months, less than 10%. So there's a lot of fall off. So you can imagine why. Why would that happen?
Go back to work.
Go back to work. So working conditions, now they have gotten better in terms of state-run, like in the state, if you have breastfeeding women, you must provide a room that is totally dedicated to that. Now that doesn't mean private companies do that. What else?
Something is, from what I understand, a lot of work. For like, it's time consuming, you can't.
It is a lot of work up front. To me, as you go forward, it's less work. I never had to wash a bottle. I never had to get up in the night and make a bottle. I never had to worry about walking out the door with a bottle. Never. So that was just...
My husband liked that.
Yeah, yeah, so do
Wake
I.
up in the middle of the night, baby starts crying, he's like,
Yes,
just feed them.
yes. Shannon, I see you smiling. Any words of wisdom?
Breastfeed and bottle feed.
It is, it's much easier. But I'm telling you, the first month is the hardest, I think. What do you all think?
Disagree.
Huh?
I hated breastfeeding.
You hated it. Okay, tell us why. Or if you would, you don't care.
It just, to me, it was much more work than just fixing a bottle. But I fed Gray for like 5 weeks or so, and I just felt like he wasn't getting enough. So we started supplementing with formula, but it was, with Crew I never even initiated, which is miserable, you know, because your milk comes in and it's not going anywhere. But it just, like for me, just convenience of not having to find a place to go breastfeed, or, you know, like you could be anywhere and still feed the baby. And then I could have help anytime. But I also, kind of a personal reason is it just felt so like feminine and very like just deeply like woman. Does that make sense? And it just made me feel really uncomfortable, you know, because I've never, I don't know, I guess just wanted to, almost like an embarrassing feeling.
Okay.
So.
Okay. This is really good for you to hear her say this, because there are women who feel like that. And I am more zealous, but I would respect that is way. I would never impose what I did on someone else, because it was a lot of work. And I did get comments as I went further along. The other that's important that you said is that she did it for at least 5 weeks. So we will encourage women, whatever you can do.
Obviously, I don't have personal experience, but I was just gonna say, like, I think in general that, like, especially in this country, it is so taboo for a woman to be breastfeeding in public, because, like, but that's not the case. Like, if you go to Europe, if you go to almost any other country, honestly, outside the U.S., it is not taboo at all to be breastfeeding in public. And I think just the fact that there's such a stigma around it makes it more uncomfortable for women, makes it where they're embarrassed, it makes it less convenient, and I think it's kind of a disservice to women, because then it takes more, I think, the choice out of their hands, because it makes it more difficult for them, and also I think a disservice to a baby. So, not that we're going to change that, but I think
well, you can.
But I think encouraging your patients is just like so important. That whether they're comfortable or not, you know, try it. If it's not for you, that's totally fine. But I just personally, I just hate that there's such a stigma around it.
And that was another thing that it didn't bother me to breastfeed anywhere, but I know it did. I know it does other women. It does some men. Cameron was about 6 weeks old. I was still on maternity leave, but we were interviewing a really important position I was at the VA at that time. So I just took him with me, and while we were in the meeting, I breastfed him, but it really did undo my boss. I just never had that problem, but it is for some women, and it's getting better. Okay, I don't know where to start. Okay, I'll start here.
I breastfed till March. But I had an oversupply, which I think a lot of people don't know about, and that was really hard because he was choking on it and it was wet, and we couldn't nurse in public. So I really wanted to breastfeed, and I did exclusively, actually until the first day of class. But I had to stay at home to do it for probably the first 2 months or something. So it's just something, I had never even heard of that, and I went to breastfeeding classes and, you know, whatever.
You had never heard of what?
An oversupply. It's not that common, but it's just something that I think is good for people to know about. And everyone's like, oh, you're so lucky, you have so much milk, and I'm like, no, this is not a good thing. It's really hard to feed him. But that, you know, I could see that would be a reason why someone might stop, because it was very frustrating.
Yes. And I'll come back to you.
My godson, his mom, it was her first, and she was dead set on breastfeeding. There was no other options that was to do. And she got mastitis repeatedly, and she had a short supply, and he wasn't getting enough, and he was dinky. And so it affected her. She felt incompetent, she thought it was her fault, and she had set her mind on breastfeeding, and then she wasn't able to. It like really affected her life, and she was like almost like postpartum, but because of the problems with breastfeeding.
Yeah.
And she tried for 2 months and was never able to get enough supply to do it. And so,
She worked with a specialist, do they have a, okay.
Yeah.
So that happens, and I'll give you some resources and places and things that are supportive in that case, and things that you can do, but that happens. That's why you really do have to allow for a wide range of what people can do, and this is what probably happened in the centuries before us. There were women who would not be able to breastfeed. Just
So I had, I mean, like with my daughter, I didn't want to breastfeed in public. I didn't, with my son, I did a whole lot more. I mean, if we were in a restaurant, I'm going to feed, but I always tried to be respectful of it making people uncomfortable. So I always made sure I covered up. I always, and I felt like, and even with like little kids, because we had a situation at, I think it was like at the outlet mall. And my nephew was there, and his mom didn't breastfeed him. And he didn't have any siblings or anybody that he'd ever seen that happen with. And there was a lady that was there, and she just, not uncovered, nothing. I mean, the baby wasn't even eating, and she was just sitting there. And my sister, it made her so uncomfortable because she was scared, like he was going to turn around and go, what's going on?
yeah.
So with, kids, things like that, I just always tried to be respectful of, making people uncomfortable. And I don't think anybody ever got uncomfortable with me, doing that. So.
I don't know where we crossed that line, because if you look back in pictures in the late 1800s and even into the 20s, 30s or so in this country, you see pictures of women breastfeeding in public all over. So I don't know exactly what changed that, Mark, in our country. Okay, I'll come back to you.
We were talking about formulas in hospitals. We also need to be aware that some hospitals are like exclusive breastfeeding, so they won't offer you formula until you ask.
Oh,
so my pharmacist, when I worked in pharmacy, they didn't like her. She couldn't breastfeed. She didn't want to breastfeed, but they kind of coaxed her into it.
Yeah.
And then when she couldn't, and the baby's crying, he hadn't eaten for like 3 days because she couldn't breastfeed. And so one of the nurses was like, just ask for formula, because it was they got money from the hospital got money from the breastfeeding foundation or whatever, so that they didn't push formula, but if you asked, you got it.
Interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know that was a thing either. How the baby was hungry, they would feed it, but not all hospitals are like that.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
So going back to what April said, my mom didn't breastfeed my little sister because she wanted to go back to work like as soon as possible, and she thought, my mom has like really sensitive smell, and so she could smell the breast milk, and she didn't want her clients smelling her breast milk. She thought it's gross, so she really tried not to. So my sister was formula from the beginning, and apparently I was too, but that's what my sister always rubbed in my face.
No, we know.
My mom won't say anything, but there's also a thing where when my sister and my brother's girlfriend gave birth, my mom was avid that they were not producing and they needed to have supplemental milk.
Yeah.
Because they're like, my mom was like, these babies are crying because you're not feeding them, because you have nothing in your food, why do you keep latching them? She was angry.
Wow.
And a lot of hospitals now have donor breast milk. My sister had an oversupply of milk, so she donated her breast milk at the hospital so that babies who aren't getting, they can have donor breast milk, or you can get formula.
Yeah, I'll give you some groups that you can either donate or get donor milk from. Anybody else? Okay. All right. So if you look at that table at the bottom, we now have about, so these are the Healthy People 2020 goals. So ever breastfed, our goal was 82%, the current data is about 80%. So we're doing pretty well in at least getting moms to initiate. And breastfed at 6 months. So the American Academy of Pediatrics is coming out now and saying that they really advocate for that first year, but even beyond as new foods are introduced. So again, it's going towards gut health and allergy reduction, and that's why you're seeing those changes. Breastfed exclusively through 3 months, we're hitting about 40% of women and about 20% at 6 months. All right. All right, let's look at on page 3, so duration of breastfeeding. It's the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Obstetric and Gynecology Academy also recommend exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months. So that's so their exclusive means no supplements, no food introduced. So why is that? Well, it's based on health outcomes for infants that have been fed 4 months versus 6 months. So if you look at that second bullet, the longer children are breastfed, or infants, then the lower the risk of GI disease, otitis media, respiratory illnesses, atopic diseases, and maternal outcomes of delayed menses and postpartum weight loss is greater the longer you breastfeed.
Is that when people thought you can get pregnant if you breastfeed?
That you don't ovulate. That prolactin is inhibitory. So the exclusive breastfeed usually don't ovulate or have very low risk of ovulating as long as they're fully breastfeeding. Okay. So the third bullet, infants who are exclusively breastfed for 4 months compared to those exclusively breastfed for 6 months or longer, lower incidence of lower respiratory tract diseases, otitis again, diarrhea, and 4-fold increase in risk of pneumonia. So that in the group that was breastfed for a shorter period of time. So here's where the AAP has come out with: continue to breastfeed as long as you're introducing new foods, and it goes to that immunoprotective effect of the breast. Especially because when we see in breastfed babies, the celiac disease is much lower. So when the first foods you're introducing are usually gluten containing, like cereals. I don't know of any gluten-free cereals for babies. Do you? I'm looking at you, but do they have them now?
A rice-based cereal, I would think.
Yeah, well, okay, so Gerber's has a rice.
But most of them would have gluten.
Would have gluten. So usually first foods, now correct me newer moms, so usually first foods are cereals. Usually you're introducing one food at a time. Then we do meats, vegetables. We wait usually on fruits because they're sweet and they love them and that's what they'll want. They're just like everybody else. Is that still the pattern?
I did baby-led weaning, so it's totally different. I don't do
Shannon, what'd you do?
What did you do?
I breastfeed
I followed the guidelines with them. But when my daughter turned 1, I actually stopped breastfeeding. And I don't know if they have like a toddler formula that had vitamins in it. And I gave that to her.
Yes, they do. They have, what do they call it? Go as you grow or something formulas.
And I also refused to give any of my kids juice or sweets until they were 1 year old.
Until they were 1.
Yeah.
And a lot of moms will curtail because they have other kids, and so it is demanding. So did that impact you in terms of, as more children came along, you spent less time in breastfeeding duration?
No, actually. Well, I had my son when I was 16, my first one, and I still breastfed. He was in years.
Wow.
I had to pump and bring it up for like 9 days, and then when he came home, I had him in the summer, so once school started, I obviously stopped.
Yeah.
But as I got older with the kids, I breastfed longer actually.
Who influenced you at 16 to breastfeed?
Me.
Wow.
Yeah, I was helping.
Wow, very good.
Well,
Okay.
actually, because I was adopted, my mom didn't know anything about it, so I didn't have any kind of resources.
Wow. That's impressive. So, are there contraindications to breastfeeding? Yes. Mostly with the mother, not so much with the baby. So 2 things with babies: classic galactosemia, that is so rare. So not very common. babies that have PKU or phenylketonuria, some of them can alternate, but usually they're going to need to be on a special formula. Mother indications, so the ones in bold you need to know. Most of them go to infection. So brucellosis, T-cell lymphotrophic virus, I don't even know what that is. But untreated TB you do know, and is going to be a more common one that you'd run into. The other one would be at the bottom with HIV positive. The two in the middle are ones to keep in mind. If they get chickenpox or varicella or the flu, then you want to separate the baby from the mom because of the infection. They can still pump, they can still take the breast milk, but they need to do it away from mom. So that's the difference there. The other would be the types of drugs the mom is using. So alcohol decreases your milk production. It also isn't very nutritious, so you're not going to have the nutrients you need to produce milk. It also transfers in the breast milk very easily, so you don't want to transfer all that to the baby. So if they are a big drinker, you probably don't want them breastfeeding. The other would be illicit drugs, so PCP would be one. Another one that I did not bring up yesterday, and I forgot to make myself a note, is marijuana. Marijuana, the American Academy of Pediatrics and the obstetrics groups have come out, especially targeting providers, is warn your mothers, don't smoke marijuana while you are pregnant and don't breastfeed. Or don't smoke and breastfeed. Couple of things. The #1 growing drug for nausea and vomiting in pregnancy is marijuana. Have those conversations with especially your adolescents and women that, you know, it's becoming more acceptable. When I was a young teenager and mom, it wasn't acceptable, but it's more acceptable in society. So people may not even think anything about it. And if it's legal, they may not think anything about it. So there was a big push years ago about alcohol that focused on don't drink while you're pregnant. Okay, it was a very successful public campaign. So I think we'll probably see one about marijuana. Don't smoke marijuana while you are pregnant or breastfeeding. We do not know what it will do to the neurodevelopment of a baby, but we do know in breast milk that it does get into breast milk and that we can detect it in infants 6 days after the mother has smoked. So it's very fat soluble, it stays around a long time. Okay, smoking. So smoking is not a contraindication to breastfeeding, but it can make it more difficult to get a supply. And it can be this says increased incidence of respiratory allergy, especially if you're keeping the baby close while you're smoking, or SIDS. So have y'all talked about SIDS? Mm-hmm. Sudden infant death syndrome? Oh, PEDS, okay. All right. Questions there? Okay, let's take a break and we'll come back and start with benefits.